How did humans build one of the greatest monuments on Earth? Without cranes, without engines, without trucks, and without modern machines. More than 4,500 years ago, an enormous project began on the edge of the Egyptian desert. The goal was almost impossible to imagine. The ancient Egyptians wanted to build a monument so massive that it would dominate the landscape for thousands of years. Today, we call it the Great Pyramid of Giza. But before the first stone was ever placed, the builders faced their first challenge. They needed the perfect location. The Giza Plateau offered something extremely important: solid ground. The builders carefully studied the landscape and began preparing the enormous area where the pyramid would eventually stand. Ancient surveyors stretched ropes across the ground and used simple tools to establish straight lines and precise angles. The foundation had to be extremely accurate, because if the first layer was wrong, every layer above it would also be wrong. The architects carefully marked the huge square foundation. Workers cleared stones, leveled the ground, and prepared the surface. Thousands of people were already becoming part of the project. But the foundation was only the beginning. The real challenge was still waiting. They needed millions of tons of stone. And that stone had to come from somewhere. Far from the pyramid, enormous limestone quarries were filled with activity. Thousands of workers and craftsmen worked among towering walls of rock. The stone that would become the pyramid began as part of the natural landscape. Using stone hammers and copper tools, workers carefully cut channels into the limestone. The process was slow. There were no modern power tools. Every cut required human effort. Workers separated huge blocks from the quarry walls and then shaped their surfaces. Some stones were relatively small. Others were enormous. And every one of them had to be transported to the construction site. But this was not simply a group of people building a giant structure. It was an enormous organized operation. Stone had to be extracted. Tools had to be produced. Food had to be prepared. Water had to be transported. Workers had to be organized. And every part of the operation had to continue day after day. The pyramid was becoming a massive logistical machine. And the scale of the stone operation was extraordinary. Imagine standing inside one of these ancient quarries. In every direction, workers are cutting, shaping, dragging and preparing stone. Dust fills the air. The sound of stone striking stone echoes between the cliffs. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the pyramid is waiting. But now came another enormous question. How could these gigantic blocks actually reach Giza? The answer would depend on something much simpler than modern technology: human coordination. Once a limestone block was prepared, workers placed it onto a heavy wooden sledge. Then came the difficult part: moving it. Dozens of workers pulled thick ropes attached to the sled. They moved together as one team. Step by step, pull by pull, the massive block slowly began moving across the desert. In some situations, workers could wet the sand in front of the sledges. This helped reduce resistance and made the heavy load easier to drag. But even with this technique, moving a stone weighing several tons was an enormous physical challenge. The workers had to maintain rhythm. They had to keep the ropes under control. And they had to make sure the massive block remained stable. A single mistake could stop the entire team. And there were thousands of stones waiting behind them. The transportation system therefore had to be carefully organized. Different teams moved along prepared routes toward the construction site. Other workers prepared the paths. Supervisors coordinated the teams. And behind them, more stones were constantly being extracted from the quarries. Slowly, the endless stream of limestone began reaching the Giza Plateau. But transporting the stones across the desert was only half the problem. The builders now had to transform those stones into a pyramid. And that meant lifting them higher and higher. The first limestone blocks were placed onto the carefully prepared foundation. The pyramid began to rise. At first, the work seemed relatively simple. The stones were close to the ground. But every new layer made the structure higher. The builders likely used ramps and other techniques to move stones upward. Exactly how they accomplished every stage remains uncertain. Archaeologists have proposed several possibilities. Some theories involve large straight ramps. Others suggest ramps built around parts of the pyramid. Different methods may have been used at different stages. But whatever the exact method was, the organization required was extraordinary. Workers pulled stones upward. Others positioned them. Craftsmen shaped their surfaces. Supervisors checked measurements, and architects monitored the growing structure. The pyramid wasn't simply getting taller. It was becoming more precise. Every course of stone had to fit into the enormous geometric design. Thousands of people were working at different locations at the same time. From above, the construction site must have looked like a giant living machine. Ropes moving, sledges moving, stone being cut, workers climbing ramps, dust filling the air, and above all of it, the pyramid slowly rising toward the sky. But this was only the beginning. The higher the pyramid became, the harder the work would become. Inside the monument, another incredible project was taking place. The Great Pyramid was not simply a giant pile of stones. It contained passages and chambers built with remarkable precision. Some areas required enormous blocks of granite. These stones were much heavier and harder than ordinary limestone. Moving them into position was a major engineering challenge. Workers carefully transported the massive blocks and positioned them inside the structure. Narrow passages were constructed with extraordinary precision. Massive walls rose around the interior chambers, and every stone had to fit exactly. There was almost no room for error. Meanwhile, outside, the pyramid continued to approach its final form. The upper levels became smaller and smaller. The structure slowly transformed into the familiar pyramid shape. Then came one of the most important final stages. The outer surface had to be covered with carefully prepared limestone casing stones. These bright stones were cut and polished to create a smooth exterior. Imagine standing in the Egyptian desert thousands of years ago, and seeing the sunlight reflecting from a gigantic pyramid covered in brilliant white limestone. It would have looked completely different from the weathered monument we see today. Workers carefully fitted the casing stones across the pyramid's surface. Every section had to follow the precise geometry of the monument. Higher and higher they climbed, until only the summit remained. Then came the final stones. The workers carefully positioned them. The outer surface was finished, and the enormous monument finally stood complete. The Great Pyramid of Giza towered over the Egyptian desert. Millions of tons of stone had been moved. Thousands of people had contributed to the project, and an entire civilization had supported its construction. The result was more than a building. It was a message to the future. Thousands of years would pass. Kingdoms would rise and disappear. Empires would conquer Egypt. Cities would vanish. Languages would change. But the pyramid would remain. And perhaps that is the greatest achievement of all. The Egyptians had no modern cranes, no engines, no construction vehicles. They had simple tools, engineering knowledge, organization, and an extraordinary ability to work together. From lines drawn into the desert, they created one of the greatest monuments in human history. And more than 4,000 years later, the Great Pyramid is still standing. Still watching over the desert. Still challenging us to understand exactly how it was built. And perhaps the greatest mystery isn't simply how they moved the stones, but how an entire civilization came together to build something designed to last forever.